Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode in the Mind Body Science podcast. Today, I had the pleasure of talking with Dr. Gabriel Fries. In a nutshell, we discuss some findings from the field of biological psychiatry. We talk about that age old discussion regarding genes versus the environment and how the interplay between both can contribute to the development of mental disorders. We talk about how understanding epigenetic mechanisms are crucial when it comes to the understanding of the pathogenesis of these disorders. We talk about the role of neuroinflammation, insulin resistance, neuroanatomical and neurobiological correlates of some of these disorders. And we also discuss how some lifestyle interventions, such as diet and stress reduction techniques, can be important tools in improving and maintaining our mental health. To end this discussion, we also talk about how there are some challenges in communicating science and how it is crucial to integrate patient voices in psychiatric research. So, now before we move on to our conversation, I would like to give you some information about Dr. Gabriel. Dr. Gabriel Fries is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UT Health Houston. Before joining UT Health, Dr. Gabriel completed a research fellowship at the Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry in Germany. He is also a translational researcher with more than 100 peer reviewed papers, where he integrates epigenomics, biochemistry, and bioinformatics to study how stress and aging shape the molecular basis of mood disorders such as major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. His work also covers suicidal behavior. In all of this, he has received awards from the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, the International Society for Bipolar Disorders, the Society of Biological Psychiatry, and from the International College of Neuropsychopharmacology. Overall, Dr. Gabriel has extensive knowledge regarding mood disorders, and so hopefully you find this conversation highly informative. And now let's start the conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mind Body Science podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of having Dr. Gabriel Fries. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation. I think we should start this conversation by addressing your research interests and also asking you what led you to pursue them out of all the questions that our minds can draft.
Well, thank you so much, Juan, for inviting me to be here. It's a great pleasure. Um, that's a loaded question. How did I get into the field, basically, right?
Yes.
So I've always been interested in the brain. So as I was in college, I always wanted to pursue science, whatever that meant. And I think it was through classes and just exposure to certain types of research that I learned that neuroscience and psychiatry was the way to go for me. And that also sort of overlapped with some life experiences with family members that showed started showing some symptoms and things like that. And so from a personal level, I also got interested in the topic. So nowadays, I've been doing research in the field of bipolar disorder and biological psychiatry more broadly for many years. And currently, I've been focused on epigenetic mechanisms. And I think we may talk about this in more details later. But ways by which the environment can modulate gene expression and the expression of the disease itself without changes in the DNA sequence per se. And coming from that, there are specific interests that I've been focused on. So, for example, ways by which these epigenetic mechanisms can modulate aging or response to stress and things like that.
Awesome. No, that's an amazing body of work. And I guess to kickstart this conversation, I will need to ask you a tricky question, which is that when we are discussing health and illness, we always have this dichotomy of, okay, how much of this is coming from a genetic component, so from a gene component, and how much of this is coming from an environmental component.
Mm-hmm.
When looking at the development of mental health disorders, can we say that certain conditions are at have a higher level of heritability than others? Can we do this form of segmentation? And also, please tell us how there is a problem when we discuss biology in a way that sort of separates genes from the environment.
Hmm. So I think Our current understanding is that mental illnesses are multifactorial in nature. Um, and what that term means is that they require both a genetic component and environmental exposures. So they are not monogenic, sort of Mendelian diseases, like many that we know that are exclusively related to a genetic alteration. So there's no gene that causes schizophrenia. There's no gene that causes bipolar disorder. But it's enough to cause these disorders, I should say. And so by saying that they are multifactorial, we're saying that there needs to be a genetic susceptibility that at some point needs to interact with an environmental trigger, whatever that may be. Um, how strong that genetic component is can be measured in different ways, and that is explained by this metric that's called heritability. Um, this has been studied in genetic epidemiology studies. One of the methods is called twin studies, where we compare the concordance of our phenotype between identical and non-identical twins, and that gives us an idea of how strong that genetic component is. All that to say that there are many reports of very high heritability um, associated with mental illnesses. And you have a very large spectrum of heritability estimates. So you have things like autism, bipolar disorder, even schizophrenia, that are known to have very high heritability estimates. So in a way, these conditions can be explained by a very significant amount, by genetic components. And then you have things like major depression or major depressive disorder that, for whatever reason, has a very low heritability, at least compared to these other disorders. It does have, a genetic component, but it's not as strong as some other ones. Um, Now, these studies, for those who are in the field, they're highly criticized because, of course, when you study twins, for example, you're measuring like the difference between identical, non-identical, but there's also a lot of environmental sharing between those pairs, right? So these very high heritability estimates coming from these studies are also to some extent inflated by effects of environment. And so that's why there are more sophisticated methods that have been proposed. And nowadays, people are already measuring the actual genetic markers, genetic variants that may explain these diseases. So right now, the extent to which we can explain the genetic component of these conditions when looking specifically at the genetic variants, um, it is not sufficient. So while, for example, let's take bipolar disorder, twin studies have shown heritability estimates close to 80%. The latest genome-wide association studies, which are these studies that are actually measuring the common variants in the DNA, they can only find a heritability of close to 20 or so percent. So there's still a big gap in what we estimate when looking at families and twins, to what we can estimate when directly looking at the DNA. But I think everyone is very convinced that you have a genetic component and then you have environmental factors that need to integrate. And unfortunately, studies that really integrate both things into the same analysis are still pretty rare. They really require very, very large sample sizes where you measure both the genetic variants and then a very detailed environmental exposures, which can be anything, right? We can be talking about trauma, we can be talking about stress, not necessarily early stress, but also lifetime stress. Um, Things like substance use, and environmental like pollutants and things like that. All of those things are, active topics of research nowadays. Um, and yeah, paint this very complex picture about the multifactorial nature of these diseases.
And in this quest of ours to better understand these conditions, where does where do epigenetic mechanisms fit into this picture?
Yeah, so they fit in pretty nicely, at least from a theoretical standpoint, because again, epigenetics um, refers to all of those mechanisms that our cells have developed to regulate gene expression and gene activity without changing the DNA sequence. So they can help explain a lot of the environmental effects on our genes. So they're a perfect mechanism to use to sort of explore why, say, a trauma of some sort can affect our genes in a permanent state, for example, even the dynamic, but also in a permanent state. So there are studies in animal models showing that things that happen in the first days of life can induce epigenetic changes in the brain, for example, of those pups that can sustain all throughout their lives until adulthood and modulate behavior later on. So they really are a nice mechanism to test in the context of psychiatry, because at least from epidemiological and clinical studies, there's a lot of that type of association that has been reported, right? So like higher use of marijuana in adolescents leading to a higher risk of schizophrenia, or higher risk of certain types of trauma leading to a higher risk of certain diseases later in life. So epigenetics may very well explain these links that have been proposed by other studies. And they include things like DNA methylation alterations, right? Which
Mhm.
um, literally, when you add a methyl group to certain parts of our DNA, and that can, in a canonical way, silence our DNA. So sometimes those alterations are called epimutations, because overall they can have the same net effect of an actual DNA mutation, the way that we think about them. Those are the most commonly studied mechanisms. They are the commonly studied in this context of like permanent states. So those are the kinds of mechanisms that we think about when we think about an early life trauma leading to a permanent change in the DNA into adulthood. But it can also include more dynamic changes as well, like histone modifications. Histones are those proteins that interact with the DNA inside of our nuclei. And so by modifying them, you can also modify how relaxed and accessible our DNA is to proteins in our cell that need to bind to it so that it gets expressed. You can also have things like the effects of non-coding RNAs, which, like the name suggests, they don't generate any, they don't code for any protein, but they have a regulatory effect in our cells, like microRNAs and long non-coding RNAs and things like that. And chromatin remodeling. So just the state of our chromatin meaning the combination of DNA and proteins, how relaxed or how accessible or how repressed and closed they are. That can also, that is one type of epigenetic mechanism as well. And so, and they all, just to wrap this up, they have all been hypothesized to be involved in the genesis or pathophysiology of mental illnesses. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
And in terms right now, there's a lot of people getting excited regarding genetic tests. We hear about DNA methylation tests. We hear about pharmacogenetic tests. Do you see some utility in them if we
Oh,
were to incorporate them in clinical practice?
absolutely. I think not right now
Mhm.
uh, yet, for a couple of reasons, but I think that's one of the main goals of this type of study, right? Is, number one, to just better understand these conditions. So assuming that these types of alterations are associated with, say, onset of illness or treatment response or prognosis, or any sort of precision psychiatry approach, like we call nowadays, they can be very useful for all of those things. For that to actually come to the clinical setting, one needs to replicate a finding that we get in published in a paper multiple times in very large scale studies with very large sample sizes. I think we're getting closer to that from a genetic perspective. So and when I say genetics, I really mean changes in the DNA sequence. So variants, things like single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs, etc. Um, And then from the epigenetic perspective, for example, measuring DNA methylation alterations, we have quite a few studies showing its promise, but not with large enough sample sizes that we can already start testing in in the clinical setting.
Right.
But I think that's very likely what will happen, and I really think that this field will be able to contribute some tests, or even be used later to develop new medications and things like that.
It's definitely very exciting. And until now, we have touched upon some concrete mental disorders, so bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, and schizophrenia. And so when we are trying to understand very complex phenomena, we have this tendency to discretize them. So basically to put them in boxes and try to create some boundaries that help us simplify what we are looking at. When it comes to mental disorders, for example, someone who is suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, it is very common that they also have some comorbid psychiatric disorders such as depression,
Yeah.
or there's also basically there are a lot of strong correlations between mental disorders, meaning that if you have one, then you have a higher risk of also having another one. In this sense, do you think discretizing these disorders, putting them into independent boxes, is a necessary thing we need to do in order to be able to study them? Or do you think the field is evolving in a way where we are not necessarily creating these differences or separations and are trying to understand basically from a more systems approach?
Yeah. My answer is yes to both questions. I think that um, having these conditions categorized the way that we currently have them, and we continue to improve this categorization, has been very helpful to um, study relatively homogeneous groups of people. And when you study biology, that's a very key factor. Like a lot of these things that we study in the laboratory, for example, they really cut across many different conditions. But depending on how progressive one condition is, or the type of medication that your group of people that you're studying, takes, that influences a lot of the results. So every time we need to make sure that our group of people is as homogeneous as possible, or that we have multiple groups, say, of people, so that we can include, the heterogeneity profile of that diagnosis. And so for that reason, I think it's valid that we study bipolar disorder in one study, and then later perhaps we try to study people with schizophrenia and then people with OCD, even if there's a lot of comorbidities between them. And you may decide on, in your study design, to include people that have comorbidities, are that have exclusively one type of disorder, no psychiatric comorbidities, etc. Um, that being said, what our studies doing this kind of approach have been showing over and over is that there's a lot of overlap between them, right? So a lot of things that I show in bipolar disorder have been shown in major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, for example, and vice versa. Um, so I think that's information that's coming from these types of studies that are showing that maybe it doesn't make necessarily a lot of sense biologically to be studying them as completely separate entities. Um, but again, this is because of the work that has been done for many years in them separately. This reminds me of something that the National Institute of Health here at the U.S. actually proposed years ago, which was a push for researchers to not necessarily focus on the diagnostic entities, but rather on these research our domains criteria, right? So focus on, say, endophenotypes or smaller domains or things that can be studied that, again, could cut across many diagnoses. So instead of studying major depressive the disorder, studying anhedonia, right, or lack of pleasure, or sadness, or some type of cognitive impairment. So really smaller variables that are still very relevant for diagnosis X, but that could easily be applied to diagnosis Y and diagnosis Z because they also show, say, anhedonia or cognitive dysfunction, etc. So that is like a really interesting approach to sort of overcome the limitations of studying the diagnosis separately. But I still see a valid point right now in studying them separately for a couple of reasons. That's why I said yes to both. I think it's just
Mhm.
something that one needs to keep in mind
Yeah.
when choosing the research design.
Yeah. No, so I think one of the greatest challenges in the field of psychiatry is that, unlike in neurology, where you can have this pretty picture of the brain, some scan, and you can point and you can identify the lesion
Right.
or, more or less the area which is causing some problems. In psychiatry, there's this endless search for objective markers. And there's also this idea that a lot of psychiatric conditions are a product of maladaptive neuroplasticity, where basically we are exposed to a certain scenario and our brain rewires in a way which is maladaptive. But this maladaptive neuroplasticity can mean a lot of things, right? It can mean that our synaptic transmission is dysfunctional. It can also involve spinogenesis. Um, in your read of the literature, what are some of the most robust findings, be it neuroanatomical or neurobiological, when it comes to observing mental health disorders? Maybe we can specify in terms
Mm.
of major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder.
Hmm. You mean neuroanatomical changes specifically?
Yeah, so basically, when we are discussing the idea that, mental disorders are caused by
Yeah.
maladaptive neuroplasticity,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean when we look at findings from studies that
Yeah.
try to assess what sort of maladaptive mechanisms went on there?
Right. So I think that there's a lot of sort of indirect evidence in vivo, in actual human samples, suggesting that. So, for example, again, I'll focus on bipolar, and I think MDD, major depressive disorder, shares a lot of that. There's a lot of evidence of, say, actual reduced volumes of some cortical structures and subcortical as well. So, for example, you have prefrontal cortex is a big area involved in a lot of planning, executive functioning, and things like that. That has been shown over and over to be, smaller in people that have these diagnoses compared to control participants. Um, there's also evidence of, for example, reduced hippocampus and some other areas, that all can account perhaps a lot of the cognitive deficits that have been observed in these populations. Not only gray matter, but also white matter microstructural changes have been reported as well. I think that goes along with what you were just saying. I mean, there's this idea that there, there's not necessarily like deaths of neurons like a lot of the neurological sort of neuroprogressive disorders in the classical sense, where we see those things, but you have lack of connection between neurons that should be there, or even like a lack of support from glia, um,
Yeah.
um, more so than actual neurons, dying. Which is one thing that differentiates, I think, a lot of the psychiatric disorders from traditional neuroprogressive diseases. Um, what was I gonna say? Yeah, so that also brings up the whole concept of neuroinflammation, right? So I think a lot of these microstructural changes may have to do with, for example, hyperactive microglia, which are these macrocytes that reside in the brain. There's a lot of evidence of that from uh, postmortem brain studies showing, higher levels of microglia in some brain areas in these conditions. Um, and from other types of studies, we know that hyperactive microglia, or just increased number of microglia in the brain, can release cytokines or these pro-inflammatory molecules, not only to the brain area but also to the bloodstream, and that can lead to a cascade of events that can justify a lot of medical conditions and things that we see in the context of psychiatric disorders. So again, I think that all of these things are still to some extent theories, but at least from a neuroanatomical perspective, there are nowadays very robust consortia that are putting together like MRI data, at least structural MRI data for sure, from many cohorts around the world, and that are now being able to show exact neuroanatomical differences between patients and controls. One that's very famous nowadays is called Enigma. So for those who are interested, I would suggest looking up like Enigma studies in a specific disorder that you're interested in, and probably their latest. They keep publishing, yearly, increasing those sample sizes, and they'll be able to tell you exactly what the latest findings are in a specific disorder in terms of volumetric differences and things like that.
I think something you said there that is very valuable is that for many who are outside the field, they might just think about neurons. But um, you mentioned other cell types, glial cells, which for a long time they were just thought of as glue. They're just there to hold things together, but they
Mm.
actually have a very active role
Oh
in the
yeah,
development and maintenance of many of these processes. We have astrocytes as well, playing key roles in a number of neurotransmitter systems. Um, but taking ourselves outside of the molecular scope, um, from what type of techniques do you think we will basically retrieve the more significant insights? So, do you think it will be through brain imaging studies that we will get a better grasp of the development of these disorders? Do you think it will be more through basic clinical science, or maybe a conjugation of all of this? Normally, that tends to be the case, but for a long time, we have these um, brain imaging studies that seem to they tend to find some findings, but we have some difficulty in moving past that again.
replicate. Yeah. I mean, of course, I'm going to answer a combination of all of those methods, right? Which I guess is not a very exciting answer. But the way that I see it, I think that there are two things. One, we're continuously increasing the sample sizes of those sort of traditional types of studies that you just mentioned, Joan. Like, for example, just structural MRI that's just measuring volumes of different
Yeah.
structures. Some people may criticize very little information that's coming from there, or it's not replicated, etc. But again, once you start establishing these very large cohorts of people, consortia across the world with many many sample sizes, or many participants, increasing the sample sizes, I think that's when we start getting signals that are true and really robust. Um, and so that was the case with the genetics field as well, right? Like many years just doing candidate gene studies, highly criticized for not having a great replication potential. But then we finally started putting together these large cohorts and consortia that started giving us actual, true, replicable,
Yeah.
robust results. So I see that field as just getting better and better in the sense that we'll have more and more results that will start to dissect more homogeneous groups of people. Up to now, you may still compare just people with MDD, major depression, and people with controls. That's great. But then we know that MDD itself is very heterogeneous. So provided that you have a very large sample size, you can start seeing distinct subgroups within the large category of MDD. And I think that's the kind of granularity that we need to get to really start, getting significant clinically relevant results. To complement that, of course, the same is happening at the molecular level, right? So the types of analysis that we were doing 15 years ago, they are, yeah, almost, many of them obsolete based on what kind of information they give. We're starting to get larger sample sizes for postmortem brain studies. So these types of studies where we use brain donated from family members of or next of kin of people that have these diagnoses. Um, technologically, we can do much more with these brains today than we were able to do 15 years ago. So we're getting, much more interesting types of results that can be replicated and validated in different ways. There's also a technology nowadays, in fact, for a couple of years now, where you can use like a somatic cell from someone, say, for example, a fibroblast or a blood cell, um, and you can differentiate that into a stem cell, and then in vitro in the lab make those stem cells become neurons or glia or microglia, whatever you want. And nowadays that's even past that, and people are actually doing brain organoids, which are these complex 3D structures that to some extent can mimic a lot of the complexity of a very early brain structure. So, it's still very early, but those things are allowing us to, to some extent start generating neurons from people in the lab without necessarily having to go and do like a biopsy, which of course is not viable. That's why I say that it's a combination of everything, because even the traditional methods are getting better and or are finally getting us some interesting results, because we're finally doing those methods in large enough sample sizes, but also the molecular level, we're getting to the brains with different, approaches. One, we're looking at it in a better way, but we're also even to some extent being able to generate proxies of that brain in the lab. So, it's very promising, if you ask me.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that incorporating, nowadays we have a greater ease of access to employ these methods. We're able to screen a lot more people.
Yeah,
And so it's
we're
very
getting
interesting.
cheaper.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because sometimes what we have isn't necessarily that the instruments we are using aren't that good. It's that we need a greater sample size
Right.
to actually get those insights. So I think that's a very important point
Yeah.
to mention. Um, Going a little bit deeper into some, there. If we were to talk about two of the most favorite neurotransmitters that people like to talk about, it's probably serotonin and dopamine. Dopamine seems to be associated with a wide array of the pathogenesis of various mental disorders, particularly psychotic spectrum disorders.
Hmm.
But dopamine has a lot of several roles, from mediating synaptic pruning to other functions. Um, where do you see the importance of dopamine specifically in terms of the major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder?
I mean, I think it's very important, right? We still think monoamine theory or hypothesis is relevant, even though there are thankfully a lot of papers that challenge that, and I think that's important in science. Um, but it's still a very well taken and recognized theory for many of these diagnoses. Um, what I think we keep seeing over and over is a lot of heterogeneity. So some people that criticize those theories or these hypotheses say, hey, if major depressive disorder was indeed caused by reduced level of serotonin and other monoamines, why does a patient with MDD not respond to a certain medication that's just increasing those levels? Well, that's when the heterogeneity comes into play, right? So I think that there is certainly a group of patients, perhaps 30% of them, that will respond very well to these types of medications. And then there are other patients that respond more or less, and patients that are, not responsive at all. And in the context of MDD, there's even a term nowadays that's used as treatment-resistant depression,
Yeah.
right? So, clinically speaking, symptomatically, they will receive a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, but they really don't respond to any of the available sort of pharmacotherapies. Um, all that to say that the theory of dopamine involved in these conditions is still strong and alive. I just think that it doesn't necessarily apply to every single patient that comes in and ultimately develops major depression or bipolar disorder. From a mechanistic standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. Um, Not just talking about dopamine, but for example, microglial activation in the brain, which we already talked about, right? As being like this producer of cytokines of immune mediators. Some of them, for example, IL-1 beta or like interleukin 1, can induce expression of transporters of some of these neurotransmitters in, say, astrocytes. So, for example, astrocytes, in response to an immune response, can start, increasing their uptake of serotonin, for example, which may ultimately reduce serotonin levels in the brain. So it's still, it mechanistically makes a lot of sense. I just think that a lot of these things have yet to be somehow tested in the human brain per se.
Yeah. And yeah, because as of right now, when we are trying to assess what type of, you know, um, pharmacological therapy is best suited for an individual, we first start with the understanding what is the best description to describe that disorder. And then generally there is this trial and error attempt of testing
Yeah,
different medications. Do you think in the future, or maybe you already have some instruments that we can use right now, where we can greatly reduce this trial and error and quickly get to the point of, okay, we know more or less what is your specific um, issue
yeah,
here, at least at a biological level?
right. That's the goal of precision psychiatry. I think precision medicine, in fact. Let me just
Yeah.
have a term that's adapted for psychiatry, which is exactly what you mentioned: is having a way of perhaps using very deep phenotyping and also molecular, um, you know, phenotyping, if you will. I don't know if I can use that term here, but to really find a priori a list of medications or a list of treatment approaches, not necessarily pharmacological treatments, that may be better indicated for a certain patient, a certain individual, even regardless of diagnosis. Going back to what we talked about before. Um, to some extent, pharmacogenetics is the strongest example of that. So using your genetic variant, your genetic profile, to already give hints about the way that your body metabolizes some of the currently available medications. Um, so I know, at least now in the US, psychiatrists can already order some pharmaco um, pharmacogenetic testing for primarily a lot of antidepressants. I really don't know about the field in other, in other types of medications. But they give hints, right? So ultimately, it's still the clinician's decision, which I think is great at this point. That just adds to what else you have about the patient for the physician, the clinician, to make a decision about the treatment approach. So I think it doesn't hurt, right? Because
Yeah.
it's just an extra level of information that you have. If I know already that usual, would metabolize, you're a slow metabolizer of a given medication. That means your body perhaps needs, a different dose of medication X compared to someone that metabolizes that drug very fast, for example. That's useful.
Yeah.
On that note, there are many other avenues that are being tested right now. So still at the genetic level, there are so-called polygenic scores or polygenic risk scores that are being tested. So those are scores that can be calculated based on your genetic profile. They can give hints about certain treatments or just your overall risk for certain conditions. So you can calculate nowadays your polygenic score for, I don't know, diabetes, or even for other psychiatric disorders in addition to the one that you already have. That can be very useful, still not clinically applicable for a couple of reasons, but things that are being developed as we speak. There are some dynamic sort of in vitro tests that could be done. I mean, as part of my PhD many years ago, we did a study when I was at Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry in Germany, where we had this cohort of people diagnosed with major depressive disorder, we would collect blood from them at baseline, and we treated those cells in the lab, those blood cells, with the medication that the same patient was actually getting prescribed at the hospital. And we found that some molecular changes that would happen within 3 days in vitro would happen only in those that actually responded to the medication at the hospitalization. So it was a really
Yeah.
nice example of how we can use our lab setting to predict, in quotation marks here, what may happen clinically in vivo in the patients. So there's a lot of creative ways by which we can start to get, in fact, to that precision psychiatry, and I personally think that's a very exciting field.
No, that's amazing, and I feel it's such an important topic because when we use the term treatment resistance, sometimes it can cause a lot of it can stigmatize certain patients, and sometimes the issue is that they're not really treatment resistant. They are just being given the wrong
Yeah,
pharmacotherapy. And so,
that's
for
a really
example,
good point.
yeah, and it's for example, in depression, we were discussing anhedonia, and we know, for example, that depression, which is more characterized by anhedonia, won't respond as well to antidepressant medications when compared to depression, which is more characterized by anxiety.
Mm,
So there's always this heterogeneity that is involved, and I think that's where the work you are doing is so valuable because we really need to be precise with these interventions. And so if we go back and once again look at bipolar disorder, we know that we have, essentially two types. Maybe we'll find that there are more two types of bipolar disorder: bipolar
mhm,
1, which is mostly characterized by mania, and bipolar 2, which is mostly characterized by depressive episodes intertwined with hypomania. Um, what do you think are some key distinctions when we look at the pathogenesis of these two types of bipolar disorder?
yeah.
And which one, in your opinion, has been more challenging to study between the two?
Mm. I think, unfortunately, we know very little about their biological differences, if you will. There are a couple of studies even trying to understand their neuroanatomical differences, like whether there are some changes in brain structure that are more prevalent in one versus the other. The consensus is that a lot of the changes that we normally associate with bipolar disorder are more pronounced in bipolar type 1, and to a lesser extent seen in bipolar type 2. I think that makes sense because even though we refrain from saying that bipolar 2 is a milder form because it can be very severe as well.
Yeah.
If we think about the manic episode as being extremely toxic, and I think a lot of the biomarker literature studying things like oxidative stress, inflammation, etc., they do show that manic episode is very toxic in that sense. Then it makes sense, right? That a person that has the bipolar type 1, which is exposed to that full-blown manic episode, may have, for example, smaller brain regions that are typically associated with bipolar than someone that has bipolar type 2 in that sense. Um, Genetically, there's also a couple of subtle differences. Bipolar type 1 and 2 seem to have an overlap, so they do have a correlation in terms of their genetic background, which again makes a lot of sense. For some reason, the the overlap between bipolar type 1 and schizophrenia is higher than bipolar type 2 and schizophrenia. And then bipolar type 2 seems to have a higher genetic overlap with major depression compared to the overlap that bipolar type 1 presents with depression. So, in a way, there seems to be some genetic, um, findings pointing to a difference between those two conditions as well. But other than that, I mean, there are many studies trying to compare those to some metabolite changes in the brain, etc. But I would refrain from listing them out as of right now because I think a lot of the differences are still in need of replication or more validation, if you will. But yeah, it's a really good point. They overall seem to be a very similar disorder, one from the other, but with some notable or noticeable differences biologically.
Okay. And for example, if we look at all of these disorders from OCD to major depressive disorder to, anxiety disorders, what is it about psychotic spectrum disorders, where we can include schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorders,
Mm.
maybe bipolar 1, and what makes some of these more chronic than the other? For example, if we're talking about anxiety disorders, it is very common to have this narrative that we can treat it and the person will achieve remission and
Mhm.
they won't have to worry with it ever again. But when we are
Mhm.
discussing bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, most of the times we are talking about a lifelong battle, which will
Yeah.
include medication for an indeterminate period. Is it because some of these disorders are simply more complex at a biological level? What basically the question is, what accounts for the chronic
Yeah.
nature of some of these versus the others?
Wow, that's a really good question, and I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately. I'm inclined to say there's likely a difference in the severity
Mhm.
between these disorders, but who knows? There's a chance that we just don't have the adequate treatments for some of these disorders. And again, by treatment, I don't necessarily mean the right drug
Yeah.
that's been developed. I mean, if you think about anxiety and some of these conditions, I mean, there's a lot of really effective um, psychotherapies that can help. And of course, they're very helpful in the context of bipolar schizophrenia for different situations and different stages of the disease. But maybe we haven't found the most adequate forms of treatment for some of these conditions, which could contribute to the fact that they are right now still lifelong, chronic, uncurable um, disorders compared to some other forms. But I don't think, I mean, I'm just speculating here. I really don't know what the answer is. Since I study biology, I'm also thinking that there just might be a more severe um, you know, biological
Yeah.
reason here for those disorders. Yeah.
And do you think there's a lot of promise now that we are investing more time in studying the gut brain axis, understanding the effects of dysbiosis, where we have
Yeah.
some imbalance in the gut microbiome? Do you think that can give us new clues about maybe how to find different ways to address these disorders?
Absolutely. I'm always very excited when I see these new systems being explored, even if at first they sound, very, very crazy.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
I think it's awesome, that's been explored by many investigators. And if even in the field of biological psychiatry, talking about dysbiosis, microbiome influences, that's not crazy anymore. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of really strong evidence pointing to those effects. I mean, in animal models, you can see very significant behavioral changes when you manipulate microbiome and reverse dysbiosis. I will say that even in the context of major depression and bipolar, there's a whole field now, emerging field of metabolic psychiatry
Mhm.
that is, I think, very, very interesting. I mean, there are case reports everywhere, including a couple of very small clinical trials already showing the very efficient or very strong efficacy of certain types of diet
Yeah.
in regulating mood, um, and that's those are being published now. Those are actual results, and you have patient advocates that say very clearly that adapting a diet X has changed their lives, and I think that we can't ignore that. I think ultimately what that diet is doing is changing some brain neurochemistry and changing some biological mechanisms that we already discussed. But they may replace a lot of the medications that we were just talking about that for some reason doesn't work with people. And I do expect that some of those treatments, even at the diet level, will also not be effective for every single patient
Yeah.
because the heterogeneity will still be there. But how exciting, right? That there
Yes.
are new avenues and new research being done with these completely novel sort of technologies or approaches.
It is completely fascinating. I know that the Bazuki group is doing some very cool
Yeah,
research in terms of the ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder and
yeah, they've
schizophrenia.
been leading a lot of these efforts, and I think that's very commendable.
Yeah,
And I think what these groups are doing is the correct way to do it, in the sense that you have patient advocates, but you're also investing in actual, very rigorous research
yeah,
to really prove and convince the scientific um, group of people
yeah,
that that's the way to go. And I also like that these studies are not just stopping at the, say, effects of diets; they're going past that and looking at the biology of that. So yeah, it's really exciting. We may be having a completely different discussion about these conditions 10 years from
yeah,
now, based
yeah.
on those results.
No, absolutely. And here there are two mechanisms that I would like to ask you, which I find to be very interesting, which is one argument is that changing our diet can reduce inflammation. And by reducing inflammation, we might be able to reverse or mitigate some of the effects of these mental disorders. The other one is that we might be also reversing insulin resistance. And there's some
Mm,
hypothesis claiming that insulin resistance is causing impaired brain metabolism. And so if
yeah,
we reverse that, we can essentially create changes in energy use in the brain, which can
yeah.
restore a sense of normality and reduce symptoms. Do you think that these are two? Of course, inflammation is a very wide term,
Yeah.
and insulin resistance, of course, it might depend on patient to patient. But you think that there are that these could be very interesting biomarkers to further develop on, and that will allow us to gain new insights on. Um,
I'm Yes, 100%. I think that's a very interesting mechanism. There are some really, strong groups pursuing this hypothesis. They have many results that you nicely summarized just now in your question. This may be one of many reasons why even these new diets like ketogenic diet or calorie restriction could have beneficial effect in some of these conditions. Um, and again, these things, you think about insulin resistance, first thing you think about is this may be the cause of diabetes, which seems to have a higher incidence or prevalence in people with bipolar disorder and major depression. That's one thing. But as you said, at the brain level, this could have many other sort of impacts that can ultimately change behavior and change mood and really be a target of treatment, not just to reduce diabetes, perhaps reduce premature mortality from it, but also just to treat symptoms or maintenance treatment, if you will.
yeah,
So yeah, no, I don't have much more to add other than this is. I think it's a very interesting topic of exploration. There's some studies showing that may be related even to blood-brain barrier
yeah,
maintenance, and there's some, there's evidence that this may also be a target of treatment. I mean, just think about you may have a systemic inflammation happening, and having a blood-brain barrier not as effective or not as
yeah,
functional could even help transfer some of these inflammatory mediators to the brain and just sort of feed forward this big loop, right? That may have
yeah.
started with neuroinflammation, led to systemic inflammation, and that can just continues to feed the neuroinflammation that started in the first place. So it's just it's a messy scenario, but I think it makes a lot of sense in the context of these conditions.
Yeah, no, the leaky brain hypothesis is definitely
Exactly.
very interesting, and it's like on the one hand, it's a big problem. On the other, it maybe gives you more access to the brain, and it allows you to have a greater ability to, use some of these drug agents.
Mm,
It's this very interesting like paradox that
mhm.
happens.
Yeah.
Um, but I would like to ask you about a part of your work, which is regarding accelerated aging in mental
Right.
disorders, particularly bipolar. And I think there's an interesting point here, which is that many of the physical disorders that we study, and by physical, I need to be careful because I don't like to make this separation between the brain and the body and the mind and the body. But for example, cancer seems to be a disease which increases its probability as the person ages. And this is the case for many disorders. The older you get, the higher probability you will have of developing them. When it comes to mental disorders, it seems that there's an opposite relationship where the older you get, for most disorders, there seems to be a decrease in the risk of you having it. So it seems to be that most mental disorders tend to show up during adolescence or young adulthood. And your work has also observed that there seems to be some accelerated aging when it comes to, for instance, bipolar disorder and even major depressive disorder. What does this mean? What can we do about this process? And is this a very common thing? Basically, do most people with bipolar disorder or major depressive disorder experience accelerated aging?
Uh-huh. Yeah, so accelerated aging is exactly what the term implies, right? And we can measure that in the lab by looking at some biomarkers of aging. And so as a group, what people have shown a couple of times, and our group has shown multiple times in the last year, is that if you take a group of people with bipolar disorder and people that do not have the disorder, these biomarkers of aging seem to be higher, or quote unquote accelerated in association with the diagnosis. What we have been seeing more recently is that that's not the case for everyone. So even when we were publishing, bipolar disorder associated with accelerated aging, there's always a very high standard deviation in our aging markers in those groups, meaning that yes, as a group, bipolar tend to be associated with accelerated aging, but there's always a couple of people still part of that group that do not show accelerated
Yeah.
aging. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, we're missing a lot of valuable information by just clumping individuals with bipolar or MDD into one single group, right? And nowadays, thanks to some large sample sizes and some fancy clustering analysis, we actually see people that have bipolar and have accelerated aging, have typical aging as we're calling, so the biomarkers showing levels that are equivalent to your chronological age, so you're aging as expected.
Yeah.
And some people who, for whatever reason, may be very healthy and have even a slower, like sort of delayed protective aging, biological aging happening. Now, the frequency of the accelerated aging profile is higher in people with bipolar compared to controls, and that's why, as a group, they seem to have a accelerated aging compared to controls. But again, in both groups, even controls, you will find all three types of people. And accelerated aging can have many consequences, right? So at the very least, things that we expect to happen normally with aging, with normative aging, so cognitive decline, higher incidence, or just incidence of aging-related diseases like cardiovascular disease, um, things like metabolic dysfunction, diabetes, or even dementia could start happening earlier if you have a process of accelerated biological aging taking place. And in fact, that is supported by some studies showing that bipolar disorder as a whole has a high risk of developing dementia compared to controls. um, there are more studies showing that even the risk of Alzheimer's disease specifically is higher in people that have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder compared to controls of the same age. And so I think that having an accelerated aging process can explain a lot of these clinical differences. And I personally think that's a very, of course, sad but exciting result, because biological aging, the way that we conceptualize, can be modulated, right? And so again, going back to diet, there are many different um, uh, eating sort of interventions that can reduce your aging, and that has been shown now over and over again with some like lifestyle
Yeah.
interventions showing that you can decrease like this marker called epigenetic age. Um, and who knows, maybe by doing so we can prevent a lot of those changes that seem to happen faster if you have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and ultimately reduce the premature mortality that's also reported by large scale studies, right? And that's
Yeah.
the ultimate goal, is to end this premature mortality that's been seen in people with these conditions. Some of it is explained by suicide, yes,
Yeah.
but a lot of it is explained by just somatic, like medical diseases, many of which are diseases of aging, if you will.
Right. No, that's super interesting, and it's something that yeah, when I first started studying neuroscience and investigating mental disorders, the aging process was definitely something that I did not associate necessarily with them, and so it's very interesting that we can maybe even use that rate of aging perhaps as a understanding of the progression maybe of the disorder as
Right?
well.
Yeah.
So that's outstanding. Um, for the last two questions, because you've been very generous with your time and I don't want to keep you much longer, I would first like to ask you what you think are some of the best non-pharmacological practices that all of us can do to
Mm.
mitigate uh, the probability of developing a mental disorder, and if we do have a mental disorder, to help us with our symptoms.
I don't want you. um, I don't have a proper answer to your first part of the question, like things that we can do to prevent the onset
Okay.
of mental illnesses. I mean, I could list a couple of things that are, biologically very beneficial, and in the context of someone having a disease, have been shown to be very helpful. And again, going back to diet, there's a lot of evidence that good eating habits can
Yeah.
influence a lot of your symptoms. It's just, again, going back to the premature aging hypothesis and even mood. Um, there's a really nice book from an author who also happens to be a person living with bipolar disorder type 2, Sarah Schley, who describes like a lot of strategies that have worked for her, and it's a really interesting book that talks about relaxation techniques like yoga, meditation,
Yeah.
all of those things in her case, and I think that can apply to a lot of different people that are living with these conditions, seem to reduce stress and increase resilience to stressful situations. And I think the stress literature is very strong in the sense that there's evidence that these conditions are associated with a higher stress reactivity, and so, you don't need that big of a stressful signal to already activate your hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis, or your stress axis. And so that this response to stress is sometimes a big trigger of new episodes even. And so if you can reduce that and find ways to deal with stressful situations better, that seems to be very helpful for a lot of patients. Um, and of course, if you found a pharmacological medication that worked for you, and I know that's not the case for every single person, keeping that treatment scheme consistent is also very important. And sometimes because of the disorder itself, a relapse and things like that, or discontinuation is very common. And I'm not talking about this, but if you can, keeping that treatment regimen can be very important. Um, and yeah, so I would suggest really listening to a lot of patients. There's a lot of nice literature or forums, or even patient advocacy groups
Yeah.
that talk about their own experiences, and I think we can learn a lot from what they say helps them. And so, yeah, just to summarize, I think diet, meditation, and that kind of thing can be very helpful. Now, I'm not really familiar with literature talking about this in the context of preventing a future
Right.
um, of the incidence,
Mhm.
onset of some of these conditions. We, for example, published a paper years ago studying children of people that had bipolar disorder, and those children genetically we know are at higher risk of developing bipolar and other psychiatric conditions, but at the point in which they were part of the study, they didn't have any symptoms. So what we
Right.
found were some epigenetic changes that were associated with stress reactivity in them. So
Mhm.
again, suggesting that just this stressful reactivity or response may be very important in the onset of these diseases. So I would hypothesize that finding ways to reduce the way that you deal with stress or reducing stressful situations could help, but that has yet to be, empirically tested.
Right. No, thank you. That's very valuable. And as a last question, I want to share with you a burden of mine because I haven't figured out an answer for this, which is um, in scientific communication, we need to share the facts. But sometimes, especially when it comes to mental disorders, there are a lot of facts. Maybe it's too much of a strong word because the facts we think we have today might not be so tomorrow. But when we are sharing some statistics, sometimes what happens is that people who are experiencing that condition may become even more so disheartened. So, for
Yeah.
example, if someone who has bipolar disorder is reading a paper on bipolar disorder and they see that there is a, I don't know, a probability of, or probability of suicide that goes from 25 to 60%. I might
Hmm.
be wrong on the numbers, but more or less
Yeah.
around that. That might seem that they are um, almost in line or that their fate is
Yeah.
basically what they are
Determinism.
reading.
Hmm.
Yeah. Likewise with the sleep science communication, where I remember that it was very interesting. Dr. Matthew Walker published a book some time ago, called Why We Sleep, which I think is a great book. But at the same time, a lot of the things that are in that book might generate a lot of sleep anxiety and in
Hmm.
turn make people who are looking to improve their sleep to sleep even less. So, how
Yeah.
do you think we can more or less navigate this
Yeah.
reality?
John, that's a really, really great point. And I've already reflected on some of those things. I think really it's up to us in the science field to see how we, report our results, if you will. Right? I think that when I started in the field, one of the things that got me excited to report these, say, biological differences
Mhm.
between people that have these diagnoses or not was that we were helping, in my mind, to reduce stigma, right? Because especially in psychiatry, there's a lot of, or used to be, I think it still exists, but not as much, a lot of debate as to whether they have a biological basis or not, right? Like some people
Yeah,
are just, you call that, laziness, or
yeah,
you don't have the will, you just have to work harder to get out of bed, that kind of thing. And I think that by showing the biological basis of that, we're saying, hey, these are disorders um, that are just as severe and biologically explained as a cancer, right? So there's a biological basis to everything that we're saying. And I think to some extent that can help reduce that stigma that just comes with a lot of psychiatric disorders. It can also help people really pursue and seek treatment if they find, themselves having some psychiatric symptoms. That's one facet of it. The other facet is what you were saying, that perhaps we went too far on the other extreme by just showing, oh, bipolar disorder is associated with this.
yeah.
And I completely understand that that can be detrimental to people living with the condition. I think the only thing that can come to mind is that we as a field need to do better in how we
Mhm.
report. I think, well, we can do better in many different ways. One is by actually disseminating our results better
Mhm.
to larger audiences in layman's terms. And secondly, by incorporating the voice of lived experience people, so people that actually live with these conditions, they are the ones that know exactly what's going on with them, what worked with them, and etc. That includes family members and
Yep.
caretakers, etc. So I think our research can significantly improve by incorporating those voices. thankfully, a lot of funding mechanisms now are pushing to that. So,
Mhm.
if you want to get money to do research, you already, in many instances, have to incorporate, which I think is great. Um, and yeah, just um, better reporting the results in a way, right? So a lot of the things, even biologically, that we're showing can sound deterministic, but I myself, for example, one of the things that I love about epigenetics is that it's something that can be modulated, right?
Yeah.
So by reporting an epigenetic change that may be driving or associated with a more severe presentation, I get so excited that that's an epigenetic mechanism because you can change that
Yeah.
by, say, pharmacology or environment or diet or whatever. So that's part of the reason why I went to the epigenetic field more so than just the genetic field, which again it's very valuable as well, but it's a little bit harder to tackle compared to an epigenetic. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a really good point. We need to do better in reporting these results, taking into account that you will have a lot of lived experience people reading that, and they want to know what to do with that information, right? So I think a
Yeah.
lot of people mean well when they publish those things, but um, we're just not doing the best job that we can when doing that.
Oh, yeah. I think that's a very powerful message, and I think some of the key takeaways are that we need to work as a community, share our lived experiences, try to understand that what we have been discussing, that these mental disorders can happen to anyone. No one is exempt or
Yeah.
immune to this.
Mhm.
That there's a lot of things we can do regarding them, and there's no stigma that needs to be involved when discussing these types of conditions. And once again, Dr. Gabriel, thank you so much for talking with me. And yeah, I don't want to keep you more. You have been very generous with your time, unless you want to say if there is something that you think needs to be said that we haven't touched on.
No, I just want to thank you again, John, for this invitation. Great conversation. I hope I did it justice.
It was
But
awesome.
yeah, no, great opportunity. I think I learned a lot with some of these questions, and just having just reflecting upon some of these things can really improve our work. So I hope you can continue doing this. And I also just want to make myself available to any listener or anyone who's interested in our work. More than happy to continue this outside of this podcast. But again, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a great pleasure.
No, thank you so much.